The quiet rhythm of Chestnut Grove, a suburban enclave outside Seattle, was as predictable as the pristine lawns that lined its streets. That morning, the steady hum of a black sedan broke the silence, pulling into a driveway that had stood empty for weeks. The car's door opened, and Elijah Harris stepped out, his movements purposeful yet unhurried. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket, a subtle but deliberate act. Elijah was a man used to commanding respect, but he also knew respect wasn't guaranteed, especially not in neighborhoods like this one. On the opposite side of the street, Walter Mather leaned forward in his creaking porch chair, narrowing his eyes. At 67, Walter considered himself the neighborhood's unofficial guardian. He had lived in Chestnut Grove for decades, watching the area evolve, though not always in ways he appreciated. Elijah's arrival, tall, composed, and unapologetically black, immediately stood out in Walter's mental ledger of the ordinary. From his vantage point, Walter scrutinized every move. He noted the car's spotless exterior, the sharp lines of Elijah's suit, and the stack of moving boxes in the trunk. "What kind of man moves in dressed like that?" Walter muttered, sipping from a coffee mug emblazoned with an American flag. His gaze darted to the security cameras perched on his porch, each angled to capture a different slice of Maple Drive. Elijah, aware of being watched, kept his focus on the task at hand. He opened the trunk and lifted out a box labeled Awards and Citations, glancing briefly at the suburban tableau around him. The houses were uniform in design with well-maintained yards and driveways, but they exuded an undercurrent of forced perfection, a veneer Elijah had seen too many times. As he carried the box inside, a gray van rolled slowly down the street. Its windows were tinted, the kind that blocked prying eyes. Elijah's gaze flicked toward the vehicle, his muscles tensing. He clocked its speed, the slight dip in its trajectory as if the driver was checking something out. Years of training had sharpened his instincts, and something about the van felt off. He discreetly noted the license plate, tucking the information away for later. Walter noticed the van too, but for entirely different reasons. To him, the van and Elijah's presence formed a convenient narrative. Drugs, gangs, it always starts with something like this, Walter muttered, the conclusion forming in his mind before the evidence had even arrived. Picking up his phone, he dialed 911. "Yes, this is Walter Mather from Maple Drive. I need to report suspicious activity at 305. A man is unloading boxes into the house, and there's a van circling the neighborhood. It doesn't look right. Could be drugs or stolen goods. Please send someone quickly." The dispatcher confirmed the call, and Walter hung up, satisfied. He sat back, watching Elijah with a mix of self-righteousness and apprehension. Meanwhile, inside the house, Elijah was placing framed certificates on a shelf when he noticed flashing red and blue lights outside. He let out a long breath. The sight of police cars didn't surprise him. He had been through this drill too many times before. But irritation crept in as he prepared himself to handle whatever was coming next. The officers exited their vehicles with cautious but determined strides. One was young, barely into his 20s, while the other had the seasoned demeanor of someone who'd seen too much. "Sir," the younger officer called out as Elijah stepped outside, "we received a report of suspicious activity at this address. May we see some identification?" Elijah kept his face neutral, his voice calm. "Of course." He pulled out his wallet and handed over his ID. "Elijah Harris, Regional Chief of the FBI." The officers froze for a moment, the weight of the name and title sinking in. The older officer adjusted his stance, his posture shifting from authority to embarrassment. "Chief Harris?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "That's correct," Elijah replied, his tone even. "Is there an issue?" Before the officers could respond, Walter emerged from his porch, emboldened by what he assumed was the validation of his concerns. "Officers, I knew something wasn't right. Did you find anything? Drugs? Stolen goods? I told you you can never be too careful these days." Elijah turned to face Walter, his piercing gaze locking onto the man's pale, self-satisfied expression. Walter faltered slightly under the weight of Elijah's calm but commanding presence. "Mr. Mather," Elijah began, his voice cutting through the awkward silence. "This house belongs to me. I moved here because I believed this neighborhood was safe and decent, but it seems I misjudged at least one of my neighbors." Walter opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a new complication arose. From the end of the street, the gray van reappeared. This time, it parked. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, holding up a phone that was clearly recording. His movements were slow, deliberate, and menacing. "Officers," Elijah said sharply, his voice low but firm. "Stay alert. That van was circling earlier. Something's not right." The older officer instinctively reached for his radio, signaling for backup. The younger one scanned the scene, his hand inching toward his holster. The man with the phone approached, still filming. "What's going on here?" he called out, his voice mocking. "Cops harassing someone? Or are we just having a friendly chat?" Elijah's mind raced as he calculated the possible scenarios. Was this man connected to something larger? Was he a provocateur? Or was there a more immediate threat? What had started as a small-minded act of prejudice was now spiraling into a situation that could erupt at any moment. Elijah's instincts, honed over decades in the FBI, told him one thing: he needed to take control, fast. The atmosphere on Maple Drive had shifted. What had begun as a petty display of suburban paranoia now felt like the prelude to something much more dangerous. Elijah stood steady, his years in law enforcement grounding him in the chaos, but his sharp eyes darted between the officers, the van, and Walter, piecing together the web of tension that had formed in mere minutes. The man filming approached closer, the phone steady in his hand. He wore a leather jacket, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. His smirk was unnerving, the kind that suggested he thrived on confrontation. "Everyone loves a good show," he said, his voice loud enough to echo off the neatly trimmed hedges. "And what do we have here? Cops called on a moving man? Or is there more to the story?" The younger officer, clearly unnerved, spoke up. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back. This is an official investigation." "Oh, I bet it is," the man retorted, not moving an inch. His phone panned slowly across the scene, capturing Elijah, the officers, and Walter, who was now inching back toward his porch, his confidence visibly shaken. Elijah remained calm but alert. He could see the cracks forming in the officer's composure, especially the younger one, whose hand hovered too close to his weapon. If this escalated, things could go south fast, not just for him, but for everyone involved. "Officers," Elijah said, his voice commanding but measured, "may I suggest you take control of the scene? You're losing it." The older officer nodded, finally snapping into action. He turned to the man with the phone. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to put that camera down and step away, or I'll have no choice but to detain you for obstructing an investigation." The man grinned wider but took a step back, still recording. "Sure thing, officer. Just doing my part to keep everyone honest. Don't mind me." As the tension ebbed slightly, Elijah seized the moment to address the officers. "Now that we've established I'm not a threat," he said, gesturing toward the ID still in the officer's hand, "I'd appreciate an explanation. Why exactly was I targeted?" The younger officer glanced nervously at his partner, who cleared his throat. "We received a call about suspicious activity in the area," the older officer began, clearly trying to choose his words carefully. Elijah cut him off, his tone sharper now. "Suspicious activity? Let me guess. Unloading boxes into my own home was the giveaway." He turned his gaze to Walter, who flinched under the scrutiny. "Or was it something else?" Walter stammered, his voice lacking the bravado it carried earlier. I thought, you don't understand. This neighborhood what?" Elijah pressed, his voice low but forceful. "Doesn't welcome people like me? Is that it?" Walter opened his mouth but said nothing, his pale face betraying his discomfort. Before the exchange could continue, a new voice crackled through the older officer's radio. "Units in the area, be advised. Suspect van matching description involved in an earlier robbery reported near Chestnut Grove. Suspect potentially armed. Proceed with caution." Elijah's mind snapped into focus. The van. It had been more than a gut feeling. It was a genuine threat. "Officers," Elijah said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you need to detain that man now. If he's armed, this could get out of hand fast." The older officer nodded, signaling to his partner. They turned toward the man by the van, who had stopped filming and now had one hand inside his jacket. "Sir," the older officer called out, his voice firm, "keep your hands where I can see them." The man hesitated, his smirk fading. Slowly he removed his hand from his jacket, but his movements were deliberate. almost taunting. Elijah's instincts kicked in again. Something about the man's posture screamed danger. "He's stalling," Elijah warned. "Be ready." In an instant, the man spun around, reaching into the van. The officers reacted, drawing their weapons and shouting commands. "Hands up! Step away from the vehicle!" For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Walter watched from his porch, his earlier bravado completely gone. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion, peered from behind curtains and doorways, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity. Elijah didn't move, but his mind raced. Years of experience told him this was a critical moment. One misstep, and everything would spiral out of control. The man emerged from the van holding a metallic object. The officers tensed, their fingers hovering over their triggers. "Easy," Elijah said softly, stepping forward, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Let's not escalate this." The man looked at him, his expression unreadable. For a second, he seemed to consider his options. Then, with a sharp laugh, he tossed the object onto the ground. It was a crowbar. The tension broke, but the danger wasn't over. The older officer cuffed the man while the younger one searched the van. Inside, they found stolen electronics, tools, and what looked like surveillance equipment. Elijah exhaled, the adrenaline still coursing through him. He turned to Walter, who was now frozen in place, watching the fallout of his rash actions. "This," Elijah said, gesturing to the scene, "is what happens when you let prejudice cloud your judgment. You put everyone at risk, yourself included." Walter said nothing, his face pale and eyes downcast. For the first time, the self-appointed guardian of Maple Drive looked lost. The immediate threat seemed contained, but Elijah knew better than to assume the danger had passed. As the suspect was secured in the back of the patrol car, Elijah observed the van closely, his mind turning over the clues. The stolen electronics and tools suggested the man was more than just a petty thief. The presence of surveillance equipment painted a much darker picture, one that might not end with a single arrest. Elijah walked up to the older officer, his tone steady but commanding. "This doesn't add up. A guy like that doesn't roll into a neighborhood like this without a plan. You need to run his name, his plates, and everything in that van. I'll coordinate with my team to get this escalated." The officer nodded, clearly relieved to have someone with authority taking charge. Meanwhile, Walter stood frozen on his porch, a mixture of shame and confusion clouding his face. As Elijah turned to head back inside, the young officer approached him, hesitation etched into his expression. "Chief Harris, I just want to say we didn't mean any disrespect earlier. We were just responding to the call." Elijah stopped and looked at the officer, his expression softening slightly. "I know you were," he said evenly. "But next time, check your facts before assuming the worst. It might save someone's life, maybe even your own." The officer nodded, visibly chastened, and returned to his patrol car. Elijah headed back toward his house, his mind already working through the next steps. As he reached his driveway, Walter called out to him, "Mr. Harris, Elijah stopped and turned, his piercing gaze freezing Walter mid-sentence. For a long moment he said nothing, letting the weight of the silence hang between them. Then finally he spoke. "Walter, do you even know why you called the police on me?" Walter fumbled for words, his face flushed. I thought, I didn't know who you were. I thought something was wrong." "You thought something was wrong because I didn't look like you," Elijah said, his voice low but firm. "That assumption nearly got someone killed today. Do you realize that?" Walter opened his mouth to respond, but Elijah didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he turned and walked into his house, leaving Walter standing alone, grappling with the weight of his actions. Inside, Elijah set down his boxes and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number, his fingers moving with practiced precision. "Agent Ramirez," he said when the line picked up. "I've got a situation here that might connect to our ongoing case. I need you to run a full workup on a suspect just taken into custody. Male, mid-30s, driving a gray van, caught with stolen electronics and surveillance equipment. Something doesn't sit right about this." Ramirez's voice crackled through the line. "Got it, Chief. I'll get back to you within the hour." Elijah ended the call and leaned against the counter, his mind racing. He didn't move into Chestnut Grove to become the center of a spectacle. This was supposed to be a quiet new chapter, a place to focus on his work while staying under the radar. But it was clear now that trouble had found him anyway. An hour later, As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Elijah's phone buzzed. It was Ramirez. "Chief, you were right to flag this guy. The suspect's name is Nathan Fields. He's got priors for burglary, but there's more. He's connected to a ring we've been tracking for months, a group specializing in surveillance and high-tech theft. They case neighborhoods to find their targets, and it looks like Chestnut Grove was next on their list." Elijah's jaw tightened. The pieces were starting to come together, but something still felt off. And the equipment in the van. "Mostly stolen, but there's one item that stands out," Ramirez continued. "A signal jammer. State of the art. Not the kind of thing you find on the black market unless you know the right people." Elijah's mind reeled. A signal jammer wasn't something you used for ordinary theft. It was designed to disable alarms, cameras, and even communication networks. Whatever Nathan Fields and his crew were planning, it was bigger than a few stolen TVs. "Send everything to my email," Elijah said. "I'll handle it from here." He hung up and stared out the window, the faint glow of patrol car lights still visible down the street. He knew what came next. He had to stop whatever this crew was planning before it escalated further. But this wasn't just about Nathan Fields or the van. This was about the systemic cracks in places like Chestnut Grove, where prejudice and complacency created the perfect conditions for predators to thrive. Elijah grabbed his laptop and began typing, drafting a report that would escalate the situation to a federal level. As he worked, his thoughts drifted back to Walter. The man wasn't malicious, but his ignorance had nearly caused a disaster. How many other Walters were out there, unknowingly feeding into the very systems that allowed crime to flourish? As night fell over Chestnut Grove, the tranquility of the neighborhood returned, at least on the surface. But Elijah knew the quiet wouldn't last. Somewhere out there, Nathan Fields' associates were watching, waiting, and planning their next move. Elijah's phone buzzed again, this time with a text. It was from an unknown number, and the message was chillingly simple. "You should have stayed out of it." Elijah stared at the screen, his mind immediately running through the possibilities. The message was a warning, or a challenge. Either way, it confirmed what he already suspected. The fight wasn't over. He walked to the window and pulled the curtain back slightly, scanning the darkened street. For a moment all seemed still, but Elijah knew better. Somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching. The morning sun crept over Chestnut Grove, casting long shadows on the quiet street. For most residents, it was just another day. Kids heading to school, joggers pounding the pavement, and Walter Mather perched on his porch, nursing his coffee with a newfound hesitance. But for Elijah Harris, the day began with a full inbox, his phone buzzing incessantly with updates from Agent Ramirez and other members of his team. The overnight report confirmed Elijah's suspicions. Nathan Fields wasn't working alone. The ring he was tied to had been surveilling neighborhoods like Chestnut Grove for months, using vans and advanced equipment to map out weaknesses in security systems. But this wasn't just about burglary. One item in the van, a USB drive, had yielded data pointing to larger, more sinister objectives. Elijah stared at the files on his laptop, his jaw tightening. The data contained blueprints of local infrastructure, including power grids and communication towers. It was a network-level operation, the kind that could cripple entire communities. He forwarded the information to the FBI's cyber division, marking it urgent. As he prepared to leave for the bureau, his phone buzzed again. It was a text from Ramirez. "We've got chatter. Nathan's crew isn't happy he got caught. You might be a target now. Watch your back." Elijah sighed, sliding the phone into his pocket. It wasn't the first time he'd been targeted in his career, but it was never something to take lightly. He grabbed his firearm from the safe in his bedroom, tucking it discreetly into a concealed holster. Across the street, Walter watched Elijah's house from behind his curtain. He hadn't slept much since the incident, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. He couldn't shake the look Elijah had given him, that piercing, disappointed gaze that cut deeper than any words could. Walter knew he'd messed up. He'd acted out of fear, fueled by years of unconscious biases he never questioned. But now, for the first time, he was forced to confront those biases head-on. He set his coffee down and walked to the kitchen, grabbing a pen and notepad. After a moment's hesitation, he began writing. "Dear Mr. Harris, I want to apologize." Walter stopped, the pen hovering over the page. An apology felt inadequate, but it was a start. He needed to do something to make things right. if that was even possible. Later that afternoon, Elijah was reviewing surveillance footage from the van when his doorbell rang. He grabbed his phone before heading to the door, peering through the peephole. To his surprise, Walter stood on the porch holding an envelope. Elijah opened the door but didn't step outside. "Mr. Mather," he said, his voice measured. "What can I do for you?" Walter shifted uncomfortably, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. I wanted to apologize. For yesterday. For everything." Elijah regarded him silently, then gestured for him to continue. "I didn't think," Walter admitted, his voice cracking. "I saw you, and I made assumptions. Assumptions I shouldn't have made. And I'm sorry. I really am." Elijah took the envelope but didn't open it. Instead, he studied Walter, searching for sincerity. "It's not me you should be apologizing to, Mr. Mather," Elijah said finally. "It's this neighborhood. People like you set the tone for places like Chestnut Grove. You have a responsibility to do better." Walter nodded, his face flushed with shame. "I'll try," he said quietly. "I promise I'll try." Elijah closed the door, his thoughts shifting back to the case. He wasn't sure if Walter's words meant anything, but at least they were a step forward. That evening, as Elijah reviewed the latest updates, his phone buzzed with a call. It was Ramirez. "Chief, we've got movement," Ramirez said, his voice tight with urgency. "Nathan's crew just activated another van in a neighboring suburb. This one's loaded with more than electronics, explosives." Elijah's blood ran cold. "Explosives? Do we have a target?" "Not yet, but they're moving fast," Ramirez replied. "And Chief, we intercepted a message directed at you. They know where you live." Elijah stood, his mind racing. He glanced out the window, his instincts screaming that something was coming. "Get me a team, now." He ended the call and went to his safe, retrieving his tactical gear. Whatever this crew was planning, he wouldn't wait for them to strike first. At midnight, Chestnut Grove was cloaked in silence. But Elijah wasn't sleeping. He sat in his living room, fully alert, his weapon within arm's reach. The streetlights cast long shadows outside, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. Then he heard it, the low rumble of an engine, faint but distinct. Elijah moved to the window, peering out through the blinds. A van, similar to the one from before, crawled down the street. Elijah's phone buzzed. It was Ramirez. "Chief, we've got eyes on you. The team is 2 minutes out." Elijah's eyes never left the van as it parked at the end of the street. The driver stepped out, his face obscured by a hood. He approached Elijah's house carrying a duffel bag. Elijah acted quickly, slipping out the back door and circling around to intercept the intruder. He moved silently, his training taking over. As the man reached the front steps, Elijah appeared behind him, his weapon drawn. "Drop the bag," Elijah commanded, his voice calm but firm. The man froze, his hands tightening on the straps of the bag. For a moment, it seemed like he might comply. But then he lunged. Elijah fired a warning shot into the air. "I said drop it." The man hesitated, then let the bag fall to the ground. Moments later, FBI vehicles screeched to a halt, agents swarming the scene. The man was quickly subdued, and the bag was secured. Inside, they found explosives wired to a remote detonator. Elijah exhaled, the adrenaline coursing through him. The immediate danger was over, but the fight wasn't. This crew wasn't done, and neither was he. The quiet hum of activity at the FBI field office was a stark contrast to the chaos Elijah had left behind at Chestnut Grove. The captured intruder was in custody, the explosives safely disarmed, and his team was poring over evidence pulled from the van. But Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. He stood at the head of a conference table surrounded by agents, as Ramirez displayed a map on the screen. "This is the last 3 months' worth of movement for Nathan Fields' crew," Ramirez explained. Red dots lit up across the map, forming a network of targeted suburban neighborhoods. They've been focusing on upper-middle-class areas with minimal visible security. But the addition of explosives changes everything. Elijah nodded, his arms crossed. "These aren't ordinary break-ins anymore. They're escalating and fast. We need to figure out why." One of the tech agents spoke up. "We've decrypted the files on that USB drive from the van. It looks like they were planning a coordinated blackout in Chestnut Grove. The explosives were likely meant for a local transformer station." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. Elijah's mind raced. A blackout wasn't just about disruption. It could create the perfect conditions for larger crimes, from looting to more targeted attacks. "Have we traced their communications?" Elijah asked. "We're working on it," Ramirez replied. "But there's something else. We intercepted chatter about a secondary target. They've moved beyond Chestnut Grove. Whatever they're planning, it's bigger than just one neighborhood." Elijah stared at the map, the red dots forming a grim pattern. "We're running out of time. What's their next move?" As the team continued their analysis, Elijah received a message from one of his field agents. It was a photo of a man Elijah recognized immediately, Walter Mather. The accompanying text was simple: "He's on their list." Elijah's stomach dropped. It didn't make sense at first. Why would Walter, a retired veteran with no apparent ties to criminal activity, be a target? But as he stared at the image, the pieces began to fit. Walter's paranoia, his obsession with neighborhood security, and his extensive network of cameras. "They're using him," Elijah muttered. Ramirez turned to him. "What was that, Chief?" "They're using Walter," Elijah repeated louder this time. "His cameras, his so-called neighborhood watch. They've been piggybacking on his setup to gather intel without raising suspicion. He's been feeding them data without even realizing it." Ramirez's eyes widened. "If they've been using him, they might still be monitoring his systems. If we act too fast, they'll know we're on to them." Elijah nodded grimly. "We'll have to move carefully. Get me a team to secure Walter and his equipment. Quietly. If they catch wind of this, they'll bolt. Or worse." Elijah arrived at Walter's house just after midnight, accompanied by a small team of agents. Walter, still visibly shaken from the events of the previous days, opened the door cautiously. "Mr. Harris?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Walter, we need to talk," Elijah said, stepping inside. "Your cameras, your systems, they've been compromised." Walter blinked, confused. "Compromised? What are you talking about?" Elijah motioned for an agent to set up a laptop. Within moments, a live feed from Walter's security cameras filled the screen. "This is what you see," Elijah explained, pointing to the first screen. Then he tapped a key, bringing up another feed. "And this is what they see. Someone's been hijacking your network, using your cameras to watch the entire neighborhood." Walter stared at the screen in disbelief, his face going pale. I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Elijah said, his voice firm but not unkind. "But right now, we need to secure your system and shut them out before they realize we're onto them." The agents worked quickly, isolating the compromised network and tracing the signal back to its source. The trail led to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the kind of nondescript building no one paid attention to. "We've got them," Ramirez said, his voice tense with urgency. Elijah led the team to the warehouse, their vehicles arriving silently in the pre-dawn hours. The area was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that set every nerve on edge. The team moved in formation, weapons drawn, as Elijah directed them toward the building's entrances. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the turning point. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of crates, machinery, and makeshift workstations. The air was heavy with the hum of electronics and the faint scent of oil. Elijah's voice crackled softly through the team's earpieces. "Watch for traps. They've already shown they're willing to escalate." The team swept the building, clearing room after room. Finally, they reached a large central area where several men were gathered around a table covered in blueprints and equipment. "FBI, hands in the air," Elijah shouted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. For a moment, the suspects froze, their eyes darting toward one another. Then chaos erupted. One of the men lunged for a weapon, but Elijah was faster. He fired a single precise shot, hitting the man's shoulder and dropping him to the ground. The rest of the team moved in, subduing the remaining suspects in a flurry of motion. As the dust settled, Elijah approached the table, scanning the blueprints. His heart sank as he realized what he was looking at. "These aren't just plans for robberies," he said, his voice grim. "They're planning coordinated attacks on multiple neighborhoods across the city." This was only the beginning. As dawn broke, Elijah stood outside the warehouse, watching as the suspects were loaded into transport vehicles. The operation had been a success, but the work was far from over. Back in Chestnut Grove, Walter stood on his porch, staring at the now empty street. For the first time, he saw the neighborhood not as a fortress to protect, but as a community that needed rebuilding, starting with himself. And for Elijah, the events of the past days were a stark reminder that even in the quietest of places, the undercurrents of danger and prejudice could run deep, but they could be confronted, with vigilance, with action, and with hope. The days following the warehouse raid were a whirlwind of activity for Elijah Harris and his team. While the immediate threat in Chestnut Grove had been neutralized, the bigger picture was still coming into focus. Evidence pulled from the warehouse pointed to a sprawling network of coordinated criminal operations targeting suburban neighborhoods across the state. The combination of surveillance equipment, signal jammers, and explosives painted a picture far more dangerous than anyone had initially suspected. Elijah spent countless hours reviewing reports, coordinating with federal and local law enforcement, and briefing his superiors. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the case, revealing a web of interconnected players and schemes. It wasn't just about theft. It was about control, disruption, and exploiting communities' vulnerabilities. But even as Elijah worked to dismantle the network, his thoughts kept drifting back to Chestnut Grove. The neighborhood that had initially felt like a hostile environment was now undergoing its own transformation. The events of the past few days had forced the residents to confront uncomfortable truths about their biases and assumptions. Walter Mather, in particular, had been deeply affected. The man who once prided himself on his role as the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood had been forced to reckon with the harm his actions had caused. His misguided call to the police had set off a chain of events that could have ended in tragedy, and he knew it. But instead of retreating into defensiveness, Walter had chosen to face his mistakes head-on. At the same time, Elijah found himself reflecting on his own journey. He hadn't chosen Chestnut Grove for its charm, or its picturesque streets. He had chosen it because he believed in its potential. He wanted to prove, to himself and others, that communities could be better, even in the face of prejudice and fear. One evening, as Elijah was finishing up a report, he received an unexpected knock at his door. When he opened it, he found Walter standing there, holding a casserole dish. "Mr. Harris," Walter began, his voice hesitant, I owe you an apology, and a thank you." Elijah raised an eyebrow but accepted the dish. "Come in," he said, gesturing to the living room. The two men sat in awkward silence for a moment before Walter spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he said, "and about what you said. You're right. I let my assumptions get the better of me, and it nearly got someone hurt. I don't want to be that kind of person anymore." Elijah studied him, searching for sincerity. "What do you plan to do about it?" he asked. Walter hesitated, then said, "Some of the neighbors and I are organizing a meeting to talk about what happened, to figure out how we can make this community better. I was hoping you'd come." Elijah considered the offer. Walter's actions had caused harm, but his willingness to take responsibility was a step in the right direction. "I'll think about it," Elijah said finally. Walter nodded, relief evident on his face. "Thank you, and enjoy the casserole. My wife says it's her best one yet." As Walter left, Elijah sat back, the casserole dish on the counter. It was a small gesture, but it symbolized something larger, the possibility of change. A week later, the gymnasium of the local school buzzed with activity. The community meeting Walter had helped organize had drawn a larger crowd than expected. Families, young professionals, retirees, they all filled the room, united by a shared desire to address what had happened and prevent it from happening again. Walter stood nervously at the podium, shuffling his notes. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, but he knew this moment was important. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm standing here today because I made a mistake. A big one. I let my assumptions get the better of me, and I called the police on a man who didn't deserve it. That man is Elijah Harris, and he's sitting right there." Walter pointed to Elijah, who was seated near the back. All eyes turned toward him. Elijah nodded slightly but remained silent, allowing Walter to continue. "I didn't call the police because I saw a crime. I called because I saw someone I didn't recognize, someone who didn't look like me, and that was wrong. My actions put Mr. Harris in danger, and I'm deeply sorry for that." The room was silent, the weight of Walter's words hanging in the air. "But this isn't just about me," Walter continued. "It's about all of us. About how easy it is to let fear and prejudice shape our decisions. We need to do better, We need to know our neighbors, to trust each other, and to stand together as a community. He paused, looking out at the crowd. That's why we're here tonight. To start a conversation, to figure out how we can make this neighborhood a place where everyone feels welcome and safe. When Walter finished, there was a smattering of applause. Then, to everyone's surprise, Elijah stood and walked to the front of the room. Walter's right, Elijah said, his deep voice resonating through the gym. Communities don't thrive on suspicion. They thrive on trust, on communication, and on understanding. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else, but the only way to make sure of that is to take responsibility for our own actions and our own biases. He looked out at the crowd, his gaze steady. Change isn't easy. Takes time, and it takes effort, but it's worth it, because when we work together, we're stronger, safer, better. The applause was louder this time, a wave of energy that filled the room. Walter approached Elijah afterward, shaking his hand firmly. Thank you, Walter said, for everything. Elijah nodded. Thank you for stepping up. Now let's make sure this sticks. As the crowd began to disperse from the community meeting, Elijah Harris found himself lingering near the doors of the gymnasium, watching the neighbors interact. Conversations buzzed around him, some about the recent events, others about mundane topics like lawn maintenance or the best place to buy groceries. It was a stark contrast to the tension and fear that had gripped the neighborhood just days earlier. For Elijah, the meeting represented a rare glimpse of progress. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't erase the harm caused by Walter's actions or the deeper biases that still lingered beneath the surface, but it was a start. And in Elijah's line of work, even small victories were worth celebrating. He thought back to the events that had brought him here. Moving into Chestnut Grove had been a deliberate choice, one rooted in his belief that change was possible even in places resistant to it. Elijah had faced suspicion, hostility, and outright prejudice before, but this time felt different. This time, his presence had forced a confrontation, not just with a criminal network, but with the prejudices that allowed such threats to flourish unnoticed. Elijah reflected on Walter Mather, a man who embodied the complexities of the situation. Walter wasn't malicious. He wasn't a hardened bigot. He was a product of his environment, shaped by decades of subtle reinforcement of us versus them thinking. But when confronted with the consequences of his actions, Walter had chosen to step forward, to acknowledge his mistakes, and to try to make amends. It wasn't enough, Elijah knew. One apology didn't dismantle systemic issues, and one community meeting wouldn't eradicate fear and suspicion, but it was a step, and steps, when taken consistently, could lead to real change. Elijah's thoughts turned to his role in all of this. He had spent his career fighting crime, protecting the vulnerable, and upholding justice. But his work had also exposed him to the darker undercurrents of society, the biases that shaped perceptions of who belonged and who didn't. He had always believed in the power of communities to rise above those biases, but seeing it happen in real time was something else entirely. The experience had also reaffirmed something Elijah often told his agents. Small actions have ripple effects. Walter's impulsive call to the police could have ended in disaster, but it had also led to the exposure of a dangerous criminal network. Similarly, Elijah's choice to confront Walter calmly rather than with anger or defensiveness had opened the door for dialogue and reflection. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, Elijah felt a sense of quiet resolve. Chestnut Grove still had a long way to go, but so did the world. Prejudice wasn't unique to one neighborhood, and fear of the unfamiliar wasn't limited to Walter. But if the events of the past week had taught Elijah anything, it was that change starts with individuals. And perhaps, just perhaps, the small spark ignited in Chestnut Grove would spread, one conversation, one apology, one act of courage at a time. This story is more than just a tale of one man's experience. It's a call for reflection and action. It challenges us to consider the assumptions we carry, the biases we may not even recognize, and the impact they can have on those around us. How many times have we, like Walter, made snap judgments based on fear or ignorance? How often do we allow ourselves to be guided by stereotypes rather than taking the time to understand? These aren't easy questions to answer, but they are necessary ones. Elijah's journey reminds us of the power of resilience, compassion, and the willingness to engage with others, even when it's uncomfortable. His actions demonstrate that change isn't about grand gestures or sweeping reforms. It's about the small, everyday choices we make. It's about choosing to listen rather than assume, to confront rather than ignore, and to act rather than remain passive. Walter's transformation, though imperfect, serves as a reminder that it's never too late to start doing better. A single conversation, a single apology, or a single act of kindness can set off a chain reaction that reaches far beyond what we can see. Now it's your turn. Take a moment to reflect on your own life. Are there biases you've inherited or assumptions you've made without questioning? Are there opportunities to reach out, to build connections, and to foster understanding in your community? Change begins with awareness, but it doesn't stop there. It requires action. Get involved in your neighborhood. Attend local meetings. Challenge discriminatory behavior when you see it. Educate yourself about the experiences of others. These small steps, when taken collectively, have the power to create safer, stronger, and more inclusive communities. Most importantly, share stories like this one. Stories that shine a light on the complexities of prejudice, the power of accountability, and the possibility of growth. By sharing, you invite others to reflect, to question, and to act. The world is full of chestnut groves, places where fear and suspicion can easily take root, but also where hope and transformation are possible. Be the spark that ignites change. Because, as Elijah Harris would say, communities thrive not on suspicion, but on trust, understanding, and the courage to do better.